April 26th, 2015. From Sam Harris to Noam Chomsky. Noam, I reached out to you indirectly through Lawrence Krauss and Johann Hari and was planning to leave it at that. But a reader has now sent me a copy of an email exchange in which you were quite dismissive of the prospect of having a debate with me. So I just wanted to clarify that although I think we might disagree substantially about a few things, I am far more interested in exploring these disagreements and clarifying any misunderstandings than in having a conventional debate. If you'd rather not have a public conversation with me, that's fine. I can only say that we have many readers in common who would like to see us attempt to find some common ground. The fact that you have called me a religious fanatic who worships the religion of the state makes me think that there are a few misconceptions I could clear up. And many readers insist that I am similarly off the mark where your views are concerned. In any case, my offer stands if you change your mind. Best, Sam.
April 26th, 2015. From Noam Chomsky to Sam Harris. Perhaps I have some misconceptions about you. Most of what I've read of yours is material that has been sent to me about my alleged views, which is completely false. I don't see any point in a public debate about misreadings. If there are things you'd like to explore privately, fine. But with sources.
From Sam Harris to Noam Chomsky. Noam. Thanks for getting back. Before engaging on this topic, I'd like to encourage you to approach this exchange as though we were planning to publish it. As edifying as it might be to have you correct my misreading of you in private, it would be far better if you did this publicly. It's not a matter of having a debate about misreadings. It's a matter of allowing our readers to see that conversation on difficult and polarizing topics can occasionally fulfill its ostensible purpose. If I have misread you, and you can show me where I've gone wrong, I would want my readers to see my views change in real time. It would be far less desirable for me to simply report that you and I clarified a few things privately and that I have now changed my mind about X, Y, and Z. Beyond correcting our misreadings, I think we could have a very interesting conversation about the ethical issues surrounding war, terrorism, the surveillance state, and so forth. I'd be happy to do this entirely by email, or we could speak on the phone and have the audio transcribed. In either case, you would be free to edit and refine your contributions prior to publication. My only request would be that you not go back and make such sweeping changes that I would have to totally revise my side of things. While you're thinking about that, I'd like to draw your attention to the only thing I have ever written about your work. The following passages appear in my first book, The End of Faith, 2004, which was written in response to the events of 9/11. Needless to say, the whole discussion betrays the urgency of that period, as well as many of the failings of a first book. I hesitate to put it forward here, if for no other reason than that the tone is not one that I would have ever adopted in a direct exchange with you. Nevertheless, if I've misrepresented your views in writing, this is the only place it could have happened. If we're going to clarify misreadings, this would seem like a good place to start. Best, Sam, Leftist Unreason, and the Strange Case of Noam Chomsky. Nevertheless, many people are now convinced that the attacks of September 11th say little about Islam and much about the sordid career of the West, in particular about the failures of U.S. foreign policy. The French philosopher Jean Baudrillard gives these themes an especially luxuriant expression, declaring that terrorism is a necessary consequence of American hegemony. He goes so far as to suggest that we were secretly hoping that such devastation would be visited upon us. At a pinch, we can say that they did it, but we wished for it. When global power monopolizes the situation to this extent, when there is such a formidable condensation of all functions in the technocratic machinery, And when no alternative form of thinking is allowed, what other way is there but a terroristic situational transfer? It was the system itself which created the objective conditions for this brutal retaliation. This is terror against terror. There is no longer any ideology behind it. We are far beyond ideology and politics now. As if the power bearing these towers suddenly lost all energy, all resilience, as though that arrogant power suddenly gave way under the pressure of too intense an effort, the effort always to be the unique world model. If one were feeling charitable, one might assume that something essential to these profundities got lost in translation. I think it far more likely, however, that it did not survive translation into French. If Baudrillard had been obliged to live in Afghanistan under the Taliban, would he have thought that the horrible abridgments of his freedom were a matter of the United States' effort always to be the unique world model? Would the peculiar halftime entertainment at every soccer match, where suspected fornicators, adulterers, and thieves were regularly butchered in the dirt at center field, have struck him as the first rumblings of a terroristic situational transfer? We may be beyond politics, but we are not in the least beyond ideology now. Ideology is all that our enemies have. And yet, thinkers far more sober than Baudrillard view the events of September 11th as a consequence of American foreign policy. Perhaps the foremost among them is Noam Chomsky. In addition to making foundational contributions to linguistics and the psychology of language, Chomsky has been a persistent critic of U.S. foreign policy for over 3 decades. He has also managed to demonstrate a principal failing of the liberal critique of power. He appears to be an exquisitely moral man, whose political views prevent him from making the most basic moral distinctions between types of violence and the variety of human purposes that give rise to them. In his book, 9/11, with rubble of the World Trade Center still piled high and smoldering, Chomsky urged us not to forget that the U.S. itself is a leading terrorist state. In support of this claim, he catalogues a number of American misdeeds, including the sanctions that the United States imposed upon Iraq, which led to the death of maybe 500,000 children, and the 1998 bombing of the Al-Shifa pharmaceuticals plant in Sudan, which may have set the stage for tens of thousands of innocent Sudanese to die of tuberculosis, malaria, and other treatable diseases. Chomsky does not hesitate to draw moral equivalences here. For the first time in modern history, Europe and its offshoots were subjected on home soil to the kind of atrocity that they routinely have carried out elsewhere. Before pointing out just how wayward Chomsky's thinking is on this subject, I would like to concede many of his points, since they have the virtue of being both generally important and irrelevant to the matter at hand. There is no doubt that the United States has much to atone for, both domestically and abroad. In this respect, we can more or less swallow Chomsky's thesis whole. To produce this horrible confection at home, start with our genocidal treatment of the Native Americans, add a couple hundred years of slavery, along with our denial of entry to Jewish refugees fleeing the death camps of the Third Reich, stir in our collusion with a long list of modern despots and our subsequent disregard for their appalling human rights records, add our bombing of Cambodia and the Pentagon Papers to taste, and then top with our recent refusals to sign the Kyoto Protocol for greenhouse emissions, to support any ban on landmines, and to submit ourselves to the rulings of the International Criminal Court. The result should smell of death, hypocrisy, and fresh brimstone. We have surely done some terrible things in the past. Undoubtedly, we are poised to do terrible things in the future. Nothing I have written in this book should be construed as a denial of these facts, or as defense of state practices that are manifestly abhorrent. There may be much that Western powers, and the United States in particular, should pay reparations for, and our failure to acknowledge our misdeeds over the years has undermined our credibility in the international community. We can concede all of this, and even share Chomsky's acute sense of outrage, while recognizing that his analysis of our current situation in the world is a masterpiece of moral blindness. Take the bombing of the Al-Shifa pharmaceuticals plant. According to Chomsky, the atrocity of September 11th pales in comparison with that perpetrated by the Clinton administration in August 1998. But let us now ask some very basic questions that Chomsky seems to have neglected to ask himself. What did the US government think it was doing when it sent cruise missiles into Sudan, destroying a chemical weapons site used by Al-Qaeda? Did the Clinton administration intend to bring about the deaths of thousands of Sudanese children? No. Was our goal to kill as many Sudanese as we could? No. Were we trying to kill anyone at all? Not unless we thought members of Al-Qaeda would be at the Al-Shifa facility in the middle of the night. Asking these questions about Osama bin Laden and the 19 hijackers puts us in a different moral universe entirely. If we are inclined to follow Chomsky down the path of moral equivalence and ignore the role of human intentions, we can forget about the bombing of the Al-Shifa plant, because many of the things we did not do in Sudan had even greater consequences. What about all the money and food we simply never thought to give the Sudanese prior to 1998? How many children did we kill, that is, not save, just by living in blissful ignorance of the conditions in Sudan? Surely, if we had all made it a priority to keep death out of Sudan for as long as possible, untold millions could have been saved from whatever it was that wound up killing them. We could have sent teams of well-intentioned men and women into Khartoum to ensure that the Sudanese wore their seatbelts. Are we culpable for all the preventable injury and death that we did nothing to prevent? We may be, up to a point. The philosopher Peter Unger has made a persuasive case that a single dollar spent on anything but the absolute essentials of our survival is a dollar that has some starving child's blood on it. Perhaps we do have far more moral responsibility for the state of the world than most of us seem ready to contemplate. This is not Chomsky's argument, however. Arundhati Roy, a great admirer of Chomsky, has summed up his position very well. The US government refuses to judge itself by the same moral standards by which it judges others. Its technique is to position itself as the well-intentioned giant whose good deeds are confounded in strange countries by their scheming natives, whose markets it's trying to free, whose societies it's trying to modernize, whose women it's trying to liberate, whose souls it's trying to save. The US government has conferred upon itself the right and freedom to murder and exterminate people for their own good. But we are, in many respects, just such a well-intentioned giant, and it is rather astonishing that intelligent people like Chomsky and Roy fail to see this. What we need to counter their arguments is a device that enables us to distinguish the morality of men like Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein from that of George Bush and Tony Blair. It is not hard to imagine the properties of such a tool. We can call it the perfect weapon. Perfect weapons and the ethics of collateral damage. What we euphemistically describe as collateral damage in times of war is the direct result of limitations in the power and precision of our technology. To see that this is so, we need only imagine how any of our recent conflicts would have looked if we had possessed perfect weapons, weapons that allowed us either to temporarily impair or to kill a particular person or group at any distance without harming others or their property. What would we do with such technology? Pacifists would refuse to use it. despite the variety of monsters currently loose in the world. The killers and torturers of children, the genocidal sadists, the men who, for want of the right genes, the right upbringing, or the right ideas, cannot possibly be expected to live peacefully with the rest of us. I will say a few things about pacifism in a later chapter, for it seems to me to be a deeply immoral position that comes to us swaddled in the dogma of highest moralism. But most of us are not pacifists. Most of us would elect to use weapons of this sort. A moment's thought reveals that a person's use of such a weapon would offer a perfect window onto the soul of his ethics. Consider the all-too facile comparisons that have recently been made between George Bush and Saddam Hussein, or Osama bin Laden, or Hitler, etc. In the pages of writers like Roy and Chomsky, in the Arab press, and in classrooms throughout the free world. How would George Bush have prosecuted the recent war in Iraq with perfect weapons? Would he have targeted the thousands of Iraqi civilians who were maimed or killed by our bombs? Would he have put out the eyes of little girls or torn the arms from their mothers? Whether or not you admire the man's politics or the man, there is no reason to think that he would have sanctioned the injury or death of even a single innocent person. What would Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden do with perfect weapons? What would Hitler have done? They would have used them rather differently. It is time for us to admit that not all cultures are at the same stage of moral development. This is a radically impolitic thing to say, of course, but it seems as objectively true as saying that not all societies have equal material resources. We might even conceive of our moral differences in just these terms. Not all societies have the same degree of moral wealth. Many things contribute to such an endowment. Political and economic stability, literacy, a modicum of social equality. Where such things are lacking, people tend to find many compelling reasons to treat one another rather badly. Our recent history offers much evidence of our own development on these fronts and a corresponding change in our morality. A visit to New York in the summer of 1863 would have found the streets ruled by roving gangs of thugs. Blacks, where not owned outright by white slaveholders, were regularly lynched and burned. Is there any doubt that many New Yorkers of the 19th century were barbarians by our present standards? To say of another culture that it lags 150 years behind our own in social development is a terrible criticism indeed, given how far we've come in that time. Now imagine the benighted Americans of 1863 coming to possess chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. This is more or less the situation we confront in much of the developing world. Consider the horrors that Americans perpetrated as recently as 1968. At My Lai, early in the morning, the soldiers were landed in the village by helicopter. Many were firing as they spread out, killing both people and animals. There was no sign of the Viet Cong battalion, and no shot was fired at Charlie Company all day. But they carried on. They burnt down every house. They raped women and girls and then killed them. They stabbed some women in the vagina and disemboweled others, or cut off their hands or scalps. Pregnant women had their stomachs slashed open and were left to die. There were gang rapes and killings by shooting or with bayonets. There were mass executions. Dozens of people at a time, including old men, women, and children, were machine-gunned in a ditch. In 4 hours, nearly 500 villagers were killed. This is about as bad as human beings are capable of behaving. But what distinguishes us from many of our enemies is that this indiscriminate violence appalls us. The massacre at My Lai is remembered as a signature moment of shame for the American military. Even at the time, U.S. soldiers were dumbstruck with horror by the behavior of their comrades. One helicopter pilot who arrived on the scene ordered his subordinates to use their machine guns against their own troops if they would not stop killing villagers. As a culture, we have clearly outgrown our tolerance for the deliberate torture and murder of innocents. We would do well to realize that much of the world has not. Wherever there are facts of any kind to be known, one thing is certain. Not all people will discover them at the same time or understand them equally well. Conceding this leaves but a short step to hierarchical thinking of a sort that is at present inadmissible in most liberal discourse. Wherever there are right and wrong answers to important questions, there will be better or worse ways to get those answers and better or worse ways to put them to use. Take child rearing as an example. How can we keep children free from disease? How can we raise them to be happy and responsible members of society? There are undoubtedly both good and bad answers to questions of this sort, and not all belief systems and cultural practices will be equally suited to bringing the good ones to light. This is not to say that there will always be only one right answer to every question, or a single best way to reach every specific goal. But given the inescapable specificity of our world, the range of optimal solutions to any problem will generally be quite limited. While there might not be one best food to eat, we cannot eat stones, and any culture that would make stone eating a virtue or a religious precept will suffer mightily for want of nourishment and teeth. It is inevitable, therefore, that some approaches to politics, economics, science, and even spirituality and ethics will be objectively better than their competitors, by any measure of better we might wish to adopt, and gradations here will translate into very real differences in human happiness. Any systematic approach to ethics, or to understanding the necessary underpinnings of a civil society, will find many Muslims standing eye-deep in the red barbarity of the 14th century. There are undoubtedly historical and cultural reasons for this, and enough blame to go around. But we should not ignore the fact that we must now confront whole societies whose moral and political development, in their treatment of women and children, in their prosecution of war, in their approach to criminal justice, and in their very intuitions about what constitutes cruelty, lags behind our own. This may seem like an unscientific and potentially racist thing to say, but it is neither. It is not in the least racist, since it is not at all likely that there are biological reasons for the disparities here, and it is unscientific only because science has not yet addressed the moral sphere in a systematic way. Come back in 100 years, and if we haven't returned to living in caves and killing one another with clubs, we will have some scientifically astute things to say about ethics. Any honest witness to current events will realize that there is no moral equivalence between the kind of forced civilized democracies project in the world, warts and all, and the internecine violence that is perpetrated by Muslim militants or indeed by Muslim governments. Chomsky seems to think that the disparity either does not exist or runs the other way. Consider the recent conflict in Iraq. If the situation had been reversed, what are the chances that the Iraqi Republican Guard, attempting to execute a regime change on the Potomac, would have taken the same degree of care to minimize civilian casualties? What are the chances that Iraqi forces would have been deterred by our use of human shields? What are the chances we would have used human shields? What are the chances that a routed American government would have called for its citizens to volunteer to be suicide bombers? What are the chances that Iraqi soldiers would have wept upon killing a carload of American civilians at a checkpoint unnecessarily? You should have, in the ledger of your imagination, a mounting column of zeros. Nothing in Chomsky's account acknowledges the difference between intending to kill a child because of the effect you hope to produce on its parents we call this terrorism, and inadvertently killing a child in an attempt to capture or kill an avowed child murderer. We call this collateral damage. In both cases, a child has died, and in both cases, it is a tragedy. But the ethical status of the perpetrators, be they individuals or states, could hardly be more distinct. Chomsky might object that to knowingly place the life of a child in jeopardy is unacceptable in any case, but clearly this is not a principle we can follow. The makers of roller coasters know, for instance, that despite rigorous safety precautions, sometime, somewhere, a child will be killed by one of their contraptions. Makers of automobiles know this as well. So do makers of hockey sticks, baseball bats, plastic bags, swimming pools, chain link fences, or nearly anything else that could conceivably contribute to the death of a child. There is a reason we do not refer to the inevitable deaths of children on our ski slopes as skiing atrocities. But you would not know this from reading Chomsky. For him, intentions do not seem to matter. Body count is all. We are now living in a world that can no longer tolerate well-armed, malevolent regimes. Without perfect weapons, collateral damage, the maiming and killing of innocent people, is unavoidable. Similar suffering will be imposed on still more innocent people because of our lack of perfect automobiles, airplanes, antibiotics, surgical procedures, and window glass. If we want to draw conclusions about ethics, as well as make predictions about what a given person or society will do in the future, we cannot ignore human intentions. Where ethics are concerned, intentions are everything.
From Noam Chomsky to Sam Harris. The example that you cite illustrates very well why I do not see any point in a public discussion. Here's the passage to which you refer. Or take the destruction of the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, one little footnote in the record of state terror, quickly forgotten. What would the reaction have been if the bin Laden network had blown up half the pharmaceutical supplies in the U.S. and the facilities for replenishing them? We can imagine, though the comparison is unfair, the consequences are vastly more severe in Sudan. That aside, if the U.S. or Israel or England were to be the target of such an atrocity, what would the reaction be? In this case, we say, "Oh, well, too bad. Minor mistake. Let's go on to the next topic. Let the victims rot." Other people in the world don't react like that. When bin Laden brings up that bombing, he strikes a resonant chord, even among those who despise and fear him. And the same, unfortunately, is true of much of the rest of his rhetoric. Though it is merely a footnote, the Sudan case is nonetheless highly instructive. One interesting aspect is the reaction when someone dares to mention it. I have in the past, and did so again in response to queries from journalists shortly after 9/11 atrocities. I mentioned that the toll of the horrendous crime of 9/11, committed with wickedness and awesome cruelty, quoting Robert Fisk, may be comparable to the consequences of Clinton's bombing of the Al-Shifa plant in August 1998. That plausible conclusion elicited an extraordinary reaction, filling many websites and journals with feverish and fanciful condemnations, which I'll ignore. The only important aspect is that single sentence, which, on a closer look, appears to be an understatement, was regarded by some commentators as utterly scandalous. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that at some deep level, however they may deny it to themselves, they regard our crimes against the weak to be as normal as the air we breathe. Our crimes for which we are responsible, as taxpayers, for failing to provide massive reparations, for granting refuge and immunity to the perpetrators, and for allowing the terrible facts to be sunk deep in the memory hole. All of this is of great significance, as it has been in the past. It goes on to review the only evidence available. We do not investigate our crimes, indeed bar investigation of them. which is from quite credible sources estimating that casualties might well have been in the tens of thousands. Your response is interesting both for what it does not say and what it does say. What it does not do is answer the question raised. What would the reaction have been if the bin Laden network had blown up half the pharmaceutical supplies in the U.S. and the facilities for replenishing them? We can imagine, though the comparison is unfair, the consequences are vastly more severe in Sudan. That aside, if the U.S. or Israel or England were to be the target of such an atrocity, what would the reaction be? Anyone who cites this passage has the minimal responsibility to give their reactions. Failure to do so speaks volumes. Let's turn to what you did say, a disquisition on moral equivalence. You failed to mention, though, that I did not suggest that they were morally equivalent, and in fact indicated quite the opposite. I did not describe the Al-Shifa bombing as a horrendous crime committed with wickedness and awesome cruelty. Rather, I pointed out that the toll might be comparable, which turns out on inquiry, which is not undertaken here, and which apologists for our crimes ignore. Turns out to be, quite likely, a serious understatement. You also ignored the fact that I had already responded to your claim about lack of intention, which, frankly, I find quite shocking on elementary moral grounds, as I suspect you would too if you were to respond to the question raised at the beginning of my quoted comment. Hence, it is simply false to assert that your basic question is one that Chomsky seems to have neglected to ask himself. Quite the contrary, I asked myself right away, and responded, appropriately I believe, to your subsequent charges. The following is from Radical Priorities, 2003. Most commentary on the Sudan bombing keeps to the question of whether the plant was believed to produce chemical weapons. True or false, that has no bearing on the magnitude with which the aggression interfered with key values in the society attacked, such as survival. Others point out that the killings were unintended, as are many of the atrocities we rightly denounce. In this case, we can hardly doubt that the likely human consequences were understood by U.S. planners. The acts can be excused, then, only on the Hegelian assumption that Africans are mere things, whose lives have no value, an attitude that accords with practice in ways that are not overlooked among the victims, who may draw their own conclusions about the moral orthodoxy of the West. Perhaps you can reciprocate by referring me to what I have written citing your published views. If there is anything I've written that is remotely as erroneous as this, putting aside moral judgments, I'll be happy to correct it.